Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the fourth session of the GMF's on Turkey conversations. Today's focus will be on Turkey-US relations in light of the recent developments. I would like to extend our thanks, especially on a public holiday in Turkey and across Europe, and I would like to celebrate your Labor Day. I'm Ceylan Canbilek. I'm a senior program officer in the GMF's Ankara office, and I am delighted to be given the opportunity to moderate today's session. Let me first introduce you to our speakers and also lay out the ground rules for today. We have two wonderful speakers. One is Ian Lesser and Barçın Yinanç. Ian Lesser is GMF's Vice President for Foreign Policy and Executive Director of GMF Brussels, and Barçın Yinanç is a columnist at the Hurriyet Daily News. We want this series of webinars to be conversational and informal. So what we plan to do today is start out with some guiding questions to discuss the past and future of the relations and analyze the points of tension as well as opportunities for cooperation. Then we will open up the discussion to your questions, and for you to submit the questions, there is a button at the bottom of your screen. It's the Q&A function of the Zoom, and you can use that button to submit your questions. And while submitting the questions, please state your name and your affiliation. This discussion is on the record, and if for any reason you missed a part, please note that it will be recorded and put on GMF's YouTube account later on. Although the current agenda is heavily occupied with the coronavirus, some other news that draw attention in Turkey is all related to the United States and relations that is changing currently. Some of the recent news we follow are Turkey delaying the activation of S-400s, possibility of Turkey being included in the Fed swap line, Turkey donating actually medical supplies to the United States, and the letter sent by President Erdogan to President Trump stressing cooperation and assuring partnership. So before we dive into the details of these developments, let us start with looking into past and present of the relations. So Ian, you always emphasize that there was never a golden age in U.S.-Turkey relations and that this was always a high-maintenance relationship. What would you please elaborate on this one briefly, and how would you characterize the relationship today?
Ceylan, thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be here with Barçın and with your audience, our audience. I mean, it's a good question, really, because there is always a tendency, you know, in the stressful nature of the bilateral relationship over the years to say, you know, it's really terrible. It used to be great, and now it's awful. And of course, this is a huge exaggeration. It's a kind of mythology. If you look across the great sweep of the relationship, at least certainly from the post-war even years, you see many stressful moments in the relationship where Turkey has been under sanctions from the United States multiple times. In the Nixon years, it was over drugs. Later on, it was over Cyprus. In the Clinton administration, where I worked on this and was often thought of as a kind of golden age in a strange way, at least from the public point of view, at least in Turkey, it was really stressful. There were sanctions even then. There were limitations on arms transfers of frigates and attack helicopters and things like this. There were big issues. We had big differences over Aegean policy and other things. So, you know, there's a long history. And then, of course, we get to the Bush years, which were stressful in another way. And we have this very odd sort of situation of the moment, which has its own real difficulties. I think, you know, how to explain this? I think there are, just very briefly, a couple of points to stress. One is, you know, that unlike Europe, and this really strikes me living here in Europe and looking at it from this side too, the US relationship with Turkey is very different. The European-Turkish relationship is often not good, but you can't get away from each other. It's multifaceted. In some ways, you're neighbors. For the United States, in a way, the United States and Turkey are not natural allies. We are allies of strategic convenience. We're allies in a way that comes from looking at the map. And we look at a lot of maps when we talk about Turkey. And there has been a kind of so-called strategic relationship, but it's very narrowly based on defense and security issues. And those for both countries are very, very closely held things. I mean, actually, the United States and Turkey are kind of similar in a way. Our strategic culture is a bit similar. We're very sovereignty conscious. We're very security conscious. We're places of a big scale. If we're not always unilateralist, we at least have a sense, I think, both of us, of our own exceptionalism. We're more alike than people often, but this doesn't make it easy to manage. And that's one of the reasons why it's traditionally been left for very skilled professionals. Just two last little points. The first, if we look today, to diagnose the problem in the relationship, and I know we're going to get into things like the S-400 and regional policy, but the collapse of trust. We don't trust each other anymore. In Turkey, this very much operates at the public level as well. In the United States, it's not so much a public issue, it's an elite issue. But that said, the strategic constituency for Turkey, the foreign policy elite in the United States, this too has collapsed in recent years. It's very hard for Turkey to find a friend in Washington anymore for multiple reasons, which we're going to get into, I'm sure. But that is very, very meaningful because it means even that defense and security part of the relationship, which was the core, has become extremely difficult to manage. So those are a couple of thoughts about why this has always been difficult. It's quite difficult today. I think there are some ways to at least ameliorate this situation, but I'm sure we'll get to talk about that. Thanks, Ceylan. Back to you.
Thank you, Ian. Barçın? What did the United States mean for Turkey in the past, and how this meaning evolved over time, and why?
Thank you very much, Ceylan, for the question, and thank you very much. I'm glad to be on a General Marshall Fund platform and to be with you guys, and especially with Ian, whom I've known for a long time. And at the expense of revealing our ages, I'm going to start by sharing an observation as a journalist. This August, it's going to be my 30th years in the profession as a diplomatic reporter. And in the first 15 years, when I had to cover Turkish-US relations, I had to have knowledge on several dossiers, several issues, starting from the Caucasus to the Balkans, from the Central Asia to the Middle East, energy issues, Europe, etc. Whereas in the course of the past 5 years, a number of issues have hijacked Turkish-US relations, like Syria, the 400 issues, the Gülenist issue, etc. Now, in the Cold War years, obviously, I think relations were less complex. US had a strategy within the Western Alliance, and Turkey had fitted in. And even if it had some maybe objections, maybe it did not felt strong enough to raise its voice and object. The end of the Cold War has changed that, obviously, and Turkey started to pursue a more assertive foreign policy as its economy has started to improve as well. So even if it wasn't for the Justice and Development Party, even if there was another political party, I think divergences would have surfaced, and Ian actually has pointed to them. And so in a way, I kind of see it a bit normal. You cannot expect them all the time to be on the same page. Having said that, obviously the ideological positioning of the AK Party has had also its cost on the relations. Now, in the past, the relations between Ankara and Washington were built on two main pillars, one military and the other one political. And to subscribe to what Ian has said, these two pillars have taken hits in the past, leading to the erosion of confidence in the military to military. For instance, Turkey's rejection of US demand to use Turkish soil to attack Iraq was one that created irritation on the US side. On the Turkish side, the so-called Ergenekon sham trials against the Turkish military has created an irritation within Turkish army, because justified or not justified, there's a significant number among them that feels that somehow US was behind these sort of trials because somehow they were in close proximity with the Gülenists. On the political pillar, the Obama administration's decision to start cooperating with the PKK, with the YPG, which Turkey believes is the Syrian wing of PKK, has, you know, exacerbated the erosion of confidence, but also, you know, the coup attempt in 2016 as well has further consolidated the sort of negative feelings among the Turkey's ruling elites vis-a-vis Washington, because some of them, again, justified or unjustifiably, were convinced that, you know, a lot of people in Washington or in the United States wouldn't have been unhappy had the coup succeeded. And therefore, if we have to come to today on what means for Washington, for Ankara, maybe it's going to be very simplistic, but, you know, currently for Ankara, it's Trump, you know, and the rest, the establishment, I think the Turkey's ruling elites are sort of convinced that there is a hostility from the establishment. So they are pinning their hopes of dealing with Trump and solving these issues with Trump. But let me just finish by saying, though, that whereas in the past, the conviction that, you know, whatever US is doing in this region has been tremendously bad in the psyche of the Turkey's elites, because, you know, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Syria, you know, whatever US has done has brought turmoil to us. I think due to the problems in relations with Russia in Syria, especially, I think they start seeing in United States a counterbalancing force that could sort of alleviate their problems in Syria. Let me just stop here if you wish.
Ian, Barçın, thank you very much for this very useful summary of what brought us today. And this is also a small reminder that for the audience, you can submit your questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And obviously, as you mentioned, Ian, no debate for U.S. Turkey relations could miss the S-400s. So without further ado, we will move into that topic. Not too long ago, the US sanctions on Turkey over purchase of S-400s looked imminent. After the battle in Idlib and reports that Turkey will delay the activation of S-400s, what are the prospects for the near future? And is it an opportunity to fix the problem once and for all, or is it just a pause in the S-400 crisis between Turkey and the United States? And how can Ankara and Washington make best use of this opportunity?
Well, thanks, Ceylan. I think it's going to be very difficult to get out of this situation without Turkey, in a sense, giving up the S-400 deal. You know, whether the delay in activating the system is a sort of conscious choice in light of US strains with the United States, or whether it's something to do with the COVID crisis or something else, you know, eventually this is going to come back to Congress as a very, very heated issue. I mean, on Capitol Hill, there's a very strong mood about this. And, you know, you alluded to this, or I guess Barçın did, you know, that there's a sense, I think, in Turkey that only President Trump is somehow holding back the tide from these sanctions. And there is some truth to that, probably, because I think he and some people around him have been unenthusiastic about them. That said, some of these sanctions are congressionally mandated. Some of the sanctions are already in place. I mean, Turkey was thrown out of the F-35 program, essentially. It's a very costly thing as a result of this. That's already happened. So to reverse all of that, I think you're simply going to have to put those S-400s back in the box and send them back to Moscow. I mean, if I can be so blunt. I mean, the problem is not a technical one. I know Turkey has proposed on a number of occasions to the US and to NATO to set up a kind of technical working group to examine ways to, in a sense, isolate NATO air defense architecture from the problems that could come from having this S-400 system embedded in it. You know, I don't know. I'm not a technical expert on it. My reading of the debate is that this would be very difficult to do, and the anxiety is not going to go away. I mean, the problem at the end of the day Yes, there's a technical piece, but above all, it's a political piece. The choice to buy the system from Russia at a time when Russian-Western relations are what they are, was going to be problematic from the beginning, and has come to be seen in American foreign policy circles as somehow evidence of Turkey making a kind of deliberate choice towards a Eurasian alternative. We can discuss whether that's really true or not, and you already alluded to some reasons why Turkey might want to back away from that. But that said, I really think that without actually some solution that shuts down this S-400 system, it's going to be very, very difficult to overcome this current impasse in relations. And we could talk more about it, but that's just my sense. And of course, we have an election in the United States in November. You know, how would a Biden administration treat this? My sense is that they would be just as tough, probably a lot tougher.
Thank you. Barçın, as you might have already read that President's spokesperson Ibrahim Kalın mentioned that the delay is only due to coronavirus, and it's going to pick up later in the upcoming months. And what is your reading of the story? What were the reasons behind Turkey's acquisition of S-400 systems? And why Turkey is postponing the activation now? Is it just a tactic on Turkey's side, or is it just a permanent decision?
Thank you for that question. In order to answer it, I'd like to recall certain traumas in Turkey in terms of purchasing sensitive material from the West, because this is not the first time we're witnessing something like that. Actually, at the height of the Cold War, because Turkey's Western allies had denied to provide technical support so that Turkey builds its own industrial complex, Turkey had resorted to Russian support. During the Cold War, Turkey's first iron and steel plants are constructed by the Russians. And coming back to more recent years, I know that the Turkish diplomats have been knocking doors in Washington, trying to get intelligence from drones in order to fight the PKK, which Turkey sees as an existential threat, and even seeking the production of the drones, and they couldn't get it. And today, I understand now they are being, the no answer has led Turkey to, I understand, produce these drones themselves. Now, the Turkish officials, the vulnerability, I'm not a military expert, but the military experts have been underlying that there's a vulnerability in terms of anti-ballistic missile defense system. And whenever you would be talking to Turkish officials, they would always say, our first option, our first choice has always been the Western allies. We have always went and knocked on their door. But again, whether this is justified or not justified, the perception is that the Western allies have been unwilling, and they have been, selling either it for very high prices, or they have not, accepted to share technology. Now, obviously, today we don't know to what degree the Russians are willing to share their technologies in terms of S-400s. But at some stage, though, I have the sense that this has taken a personal turn as well, especially after the coup attempt 2016. The fact that Turkey has improved its relations with Russia, the fact that Turkish F-16 were actually bombing the Turkish parliament might have had its effect on Turkey's decision to purchase S-400. Let me recall that Turkey had drawn a Russian warplane in 2015. So some are saying that this was actually the purchase of S-400 was actually the payoff for that. But if we have to come today and to talk about the delay, now, we have to underline the fact that actually I think there is no official statement, or we have just heard Mr. Ibrahim Kalın to say that they are delayed due to COVID-19. Now, I guess the military experts would be questioning how COVID-19 might have mitigated any threat. So I don't think it's very convincing. So I would rather say that the message has gone further down the line, that the activation would trigger sanctions, and that maybe there was a bit of a more understanding that Trump might be unable to stop the activation, the triggering of the sanctions. Obviously, the fact that the Turkey's economic issues might be even further exacerbated following the COVID-19 pandemic might have factored in. But also, perhaps the decision was taken a few weeks before, I don't know, but most probably the fact that relations with Russia is a little bit turning sour might have also had its effect on that, because let's not forget that, you know, normally US is supposed to was called our strategic partner, whereas we've seen Turkish leadership calling Russia as a strategic partner, but you don't expect your strategic partner to turn a blind eye when a regime they support kills Turkish soldiers. So I'm pretty sure this has left a mark in Ankara, which might also provided them a reason to explain the delay. Now, whether this is short-term, long-term, I'm not sure how to answer it. What matters here, I think, is how this decision to delay is going to affect bilateral relations, because my reading of this reaction from Washington is that a statement here and there by Mr. Cullen that its delay is not going to satisfy Washington. In fact, U.S. ambassador yesterday was very clear cut in saying that U.S. concerns about S-400 is continuing. So my reading is that U.S. expects a more clear-cut statement, if not an official statement, a more guaranteed assurance about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Barçın. And I believe no webinar during the pandemic can do without mentioning the pandemic itself. And Ian, the post-pandemic era will obviously be a test for the American economy and the diplomacy. Given the domestic priorities, it will be much more difficult to attract interest and support in the American engagement overseas. So do you think this might cause the United States to turn a blind eye on the recently aligned Turkish-US interest in the Syrian war?
Well, I mean, it's an extraordinarily complex thing, and you know, it turns in a way on how you think this crisis is going to evolve. But I mean, leave aside the health dimension of it, the economic dimension of it clearly is going to be very deep and is going to last for some time, and it's going to have very dramatic effects. Different perhaps in Turkey and in the United States, but I think in both cases it's going to be a complicating factor. It's a huge distraction already. All sorts of crises that were on the front page you can't find them in the news anymore. Syria is one of them. Libya is another. And that's going to be a factor. Of course, in the United States, Turkey policy was always a specialist concern. So to an extent, I won't say it's insulated from this. It's not, because there's a congressional dimension and other things. We also have an election, as I say. There are a lot of distractions. But you know, the professional management of the relationship goes on, both at the military level and the civilian level. What becomes much more difficult, of course, is any sort of economic interaction that would really be interesting for the two countries. It's always been underdeveloped. Under the kind of conditions that we're headed into, I mean, Turkey may face some very serious requirements. I know the government has said repeatedly they're not interested in, won't need an IMF package, but who knows? And if Turkey does need that, the United States, you know, the US vote in that is quite significant. And at that point, there may be a new administration in the United States. We'd have to see. So yes, there is this distraction effect. I think in terms of regional affairs, Turkey is already facing a kind of durable chaos on its borders. Turkey needs help in that regard. And it will be harder to mobilize that help, whether it's European or American, I think, when governments are so heavily focused on managing the consequences of this crisis. So it's a hugely complicating factor. It does make it more difficult, I think, to solve big problems, just because the attention is focused elsewhere. And if you'll permit me just to comment on something that Barçın said, I agreed with her very much in her assessment of sort of why Turkey was mistrustful of the US as a supplier of defense goods. I mean, this is absolutely correct. I mean, there is responsibility in a sense on the American side that stretches over many years, where we somehow didn't manage this properly. Probably at a certain point, Turkey would have been more, happier to buy Patriot. But, there's always been this question about how reliable we are as a supplier. We can sell something commercially, but at the end of the day, Congress has to regulate that and has to permit it. And you can actually, you can stop at a certain point, having bought the system. So, there is a certain degree of mistrust. I don't know what will happen. I think in some ways the biggest variable here is who will win the election in the United States. It will make a huge difference in terms of US foreign policy, in my view. It won't solve everything overnight. In some ways for Turkey, it might complicate things. But, it certainly, I think, just let me put it this way. I think Turkey is, in a way, in the mainstream of our allies. When looking at the United States, you would like a predictable posture in Washington. You want predictability from Washington. And there hasn't been a lot of that in recent years. You could get more, it seems to me, even if some of the issues would be tough to work out with a new administration. Sorry, back to you, Ceylan. And sorry for drifting off into a slightly different aspect there as well, but I was struck by what Barçın had said.
Thank you. So before proceeding with Barçın, I just want to make a brief reminder that Q&A session is open and you can submit your questions. I see that several are coming, so please feel free. We want this to be interactive as possible. Barçın, you already mentioned economy in your remarks, and this will be obviously impacted by the coronavirus. And like most economies across globe, Turkey will suffer from the consequences. And do you think the government would opt not to get involved in further transnational tensions and care more for the Western alliance to keep the channel open for funding? Or do you see any upcoming new tensions that can create some other defense spending and other things?
Well, looking from the recent charm offensive, I would say, of Turkey, sending medical material to United States, to Europe, yeah, one can say that there's definitely an effort to improve Turkey's image within the Western alliance, although these medical assistance are not just limited to the Western countries. But to expect that because of Turkey's economic troubles, Turkey would be changing its regional policies, I think it will be premature to jump into such conclusions. Honestly, in terms of improving Turkey's relations with European Union, for instance, releasing the journalists from jail, or people like Osman Kavala would have really improved relations with European Union, which have in turn improved the economic relations. But I think the things doesn't work like that in Ankara, and I have to recall the fact that Turkey's military cross-border operations to Syria, for instance, have taken place at times when you would least expect them to take place. The first one being right after the coup attempt, or when Turkey's last Peace Spring operation, when it took place, the Turkish economy was already showing a lot of signs of distress. So I mean, I can't make a direct correlation between the two. Obviously, it might have an impact on that, but I think, as Ian has already said, it also depends on how United States and Europe, how the Western Alliance would be approaching certain issues in our region. For instance, take the Libya issue. Where do we place Western Alliance on that Libya issue? Turkey finds itself in the same corner with United States, whereas France apparently is supporting Haftar. Therefore, there's no doubt whatsoever that already economic issues are at the top of Turkey's agenda. A lot of people are expecting a lot of difficult times, and Turkey needs foreign currency, and there has apparently talks with Washington, though we haven't seen a result yet. But having said that, as I said, I wouldn't expect big U-turns in terms of foreign policy.
Thank you, Barçın. The questions I have are just limited for the moment, and we will move to the questions and answer session with our audience. And for that, I will turn to my colleague, director Özgür, and he graciously accepted to read out the questions. Özgür, over to you.
Thank you, Ceylan. So the first question is from Robert Bell, I guess to Barçın, which is, where does Erdogan stand now on Turkey's acquiring its own nuclear weapons capability, which he suggested was a possibility last fall in his United Nations General Assembly speech? Barçın?
Well, I think it's where he said it. He said it there, and then he just left it there.
Okay, thank you, Barçın. So the second question is from General Ben Hodges. The question is, why is the Greater Black Sea region so strategically important for the United States and the West? How do we build understanding and advocacy for this strategic importance in Washington, D.C.? I guess this question is for Ian.
Okay, well, Ben, good to see you virtually. Thanks for the question. I share your interest in the region because if you think about the sort of future trajectory of Russian-Western relations, one of the places this is likely to play out in a very serious way will be around the Black Sea as a whole, and it's sort of not gotten the attention that it probably should. And the United States is a stakeholder in this. NATO is a stakeholder in this. Turkey is a very direct stakeholder in this. It should, in theory, be a natural sphere for deeper U.S. Turkish, but in particular Turkey-NATO cooperation. But it's not easy because this is one of the places where I think Turkey's own sense of sovereignty and in a sense, regional ownership of security management has been most obvious. For all of the anxieties that Turkey has had historically about Russia and the Black Sea, and there have been and there should be many, it's always been difficult to get a more active NATO role in the region. Turkey is just very sensitive on this point. If it was possible to put Turkish-US relations on a better strategic footing, this is probably one of the places where it could really make a difference. You have a lot of experience in it, Ben. I mean, my sense is that if we could put more of it into a multilateral NATO context and less of it in a bilateral context, probably we would have a better opportunity. Maybe one possibility, ironically, if NATO develops a more distinctive kind of political dimension, as Macron and others have argued, one of the places where this could be felt would be around the Black Sea, where there are a lot of decisions to be made and a lot of assessments to be shared. So we'll have to see what will happen. But I absolutely agree with you. It is one of the underappreciated areas for closer cooperation between Turkey and its Western allies.
Özgür, just before we move on, maybe let me just elaborate on my previous answer. The gist of the answer is still valid, but to just give a further background, I think probably he meant to make a provocative statement, but under normal circumstances, to my knowledge, Turkey is still loyal to multilateral frameworks in terms of nuclear proliferation, etc. And it's a member of it. It wouldn't want this framework to be hit. And in fact, the current pandemic is going to further underline the importance of cooperation, especially in terms of how you know, these viruses can be used as weapons. So to my knowledge, Turkey's position in terms of the nuclear international framework has not changed.
But Barçın, let me ask you a follow-up question. Many things that Turkey has done, or President Erdogan has done, actually started with a statement from President Erdogan, which everyone assumed was for domestic political consumption. And then the statement was forgotten for many years, at the end of which actually it became a policy, including the S-400, including, for example, the recent, let's say, refugee crisis between Turkey and the EU. President Erdogan had actually been making such statements for several months now, or even years, that he would at some point push the refugees towards Europe, and everybody said that's for domestic political consumption, but at the end he said it. So far it's Turkey's policy that it's a non-nuclear country, but who knows? I mean, President Erdogan made the statement, and at some future date it could become reality. What do you think, Ian?
Well, actually, you know, two things to say on this. First of all, you know, you're not the only country where offhand statements by the leadership actually become policy in some cases. I mean, you know, U.S. has an experience at the moment where whether it's on migration policy or it's on trade or other things, you know, you have to some extent, the president does what he says he's going to do, and he's capable of bringing the administration along with him. And you're describing, in a way, a similar situation in Turkey on a very different issue. I would be very surprised if Turkey went in the direction of you know, breaching the NPT and developing a nuclear weapons capability, or even a near nuclear. Technically, the country could harness the resources to do it, I'm sure, but under the current circumstances, under the enormous economic pressures that we're going to face, you know, far better for Turkey to rely on the solidity of the NATO nuclear deterrent. I mean, that's one of the key assets Turkey has from being a member of that club. I would find it a very difficult step to take, but you know, who knows, under very difficult circumstances, different circumstances in a decade's time, there could be other choices, not only for Turkey, but maybe for some of Turkey's neighbors that would drive Turkey in that direction. But I still find it a very unlikely prospect.
Do you want my take, or
please,
shall we move on?
Please,
okay,
Barçın.
just a small comment. Well, sometimes actions, we all have also seen when action does not fit the rhetoric either. You know, I haven't heard too many times President Erdogan speaking so fondly of NATO, but then you would look at Turkey's contribution to NATO. It's one of the highest ones, and although looking to his rhetoric, you would think that Turkey is rather unilateralist, but actually, you know, Turkey still is very loyal of multinational frameworks, and it has been one of the biggest supporters of UN framework, for instance, you know, asking UN organizations having their regional hubs in Istanbul, etc.
We have other questions, but I would like to ask a follow-up question to Ian on this one again. So Ian, what would be the implications for U.S.-Turkey relations, assuming that Turkey took the step towards becoming a nuclear state?
Well, I mean, it would depend very much on the health of the relationship in general. If we were in a period when, you know, the United States, and let me put it this way, it's negative. Just let me stop at that, but let me say it could be negative or really dreadful. You know, if we were in a place where the relationship was functional across a series of issues and we didn't have the problems that we're talking about today, that would be one thing. And if for example, Turkey was facing, you know, in its region, a nuclear Iran, a nuclearizing Saudi Arabia, etc. We can imagine different kinds of scenarios. But I think, you know, again, I come back to the point, as long as Turkey's a member of NATO, NATO's nuclear deterrence posture remains what it is, with the US as part of that. I do not see any incentive for Turkey to go its own way to do something like this. And if it did, it would raise all kinds of questions. I mean, you know, it's not that the US doesn't, I don't think, have a problem with Turkey developing indigenous defense industrial capacity in the conventional realm. It's a competitiveness issue, maybe among other things, but it's not really a strategic issue. After all, I mean, Turkey built an F-16 infrastructure to manufacture F-16s for sale globally. If you wanted a high quality F-16 in the world, that's where you went to Turkey. If you were Egypt or others, you bought them. They were made in Turkey. It might have been General Dynamics that started it, but it was built in Turkey. I mean, all that stuff works when the relationship is functional and the technology licensing and all of this functions predictably. But when you get into the nuclear sphere, you're really talking about something else again. And, you know, just to conclude, if Turkey were to go that road, it's probably because the world has gone in a direction that compels that, and that's a much bigger problem than just Turkey developing this capacity.
Thank you, Ian. The next question is to Barçın from Kadri Taş'tan. So Kadri says, for some years, Ankara has been balancing its deteriorating relationship with the West by improving them with Russia. Is now Turkey trying to balance its deteriorating relationship with Russia with an improved relationship with the United States? And he's asking this question particularly with reference to postponing the activation of the S-400s.
Correct. I think Turkey's recent experience in Idlib with Russia has been might have been a wake-up call for Turkey, although a lot of experts, and including me, we kept saying that, you know, the frustrations of Turkey vis-a-vis United States should not push Turkey so much unconditionally to Russia. As I previously have said, I think there is no doubt, probably in the minds of the decision makers in Ankara, that Russia is responsible, or, you know, shares the blame in the death of the Turkish soldiers in Idlib, and that's why Turkey now sees U.S. as a counterbalancing force. But let me also underline that one of the reasons why it has a more also positive view on U.S. is that there is some kind of a improvement of the situation in terms of Turkish-U.S. relations in Syria. Because my understanding is that the Turkish side now has less complaints about U.S. presence in Syria, that they have somehow built up a working relationship in northeast Syria. And so that has helped as well. And certainly, as I had underlined previously, the disappointments and the problems that Turkey has seen in its relations with Syria might have factored in its decision of S-400, because now obviously Turkey has had problematic relations with US, but I think it has an accumulated culture of talking with US, despite the fact that there has been an erosion of confidence between the two sides, despite the fact that this dialogue has taken a hit. I think there are still some power centers in Ankara and Washington, which know each other, which understands each other dialect. Whereas with the Russians, I think it has been much more one-sided. I'm not sure it has been a dialogue among equals, and I think Ankara has been increasingly experiencing this unequal relationship. And I am hearing that there has been a lot of frustration in Ankara during the dialogues and meetings with the Russians, who has been taking very condescending attitudes, intransigent attitudes. So I think increasingly the Turkish side is seeing not always this nice face of the Russians, but the darker face of the Russians as well.
Before going on to the next question, and actually I will turn to Ian with a follow-up, but one attendee has made the hand gesture indicating that she or he wants to speak, but the only way to ask questions is through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please use that button. So Ian, as a follow-up, so the Idlib battle has ended with a ceasefire agreed upon in Moscow, but the mood in Ankara is that this is actually a temporary ceasefire, and the next phase of the Idlib battle is a matter of time. Of course, the corona pandemic may have delayed that as well. But in case that happens again, are there ways the United States can reassure Turkey?
Well, first of all, I think the judgment that this is probably a temporary ceasefire is probably correct. I mean, I just fail to see how the Syrian regime is going to fail to press over the next weeks, months, years, however long it takes, the sort of project of reconsolidating its control over all of Syria. And Russia is going to back them in that. And so it seems to me that the risks that can flow for Turkey of a clash with Syria directly, of a clash possibly again with Russia in some form, of proxies operating with loose rules of engagement, dragging in their patrons. This is going to be an ongoing source of risk for Turkey and therefore for NATO and for the United States. And so, you know, yes, I do think that there is something, again, to go back to the point that I think Barçın made earlier, there is something that will remain valuable in terms of the US presence and relationship, even with the YPG on the ground in Syria, because, you know, did Turkey ever really want the United States out of the border region? Probably not. At the end of the day, it's a stabilizing factor, even if we had big differences. And because I can well imagine over the next years, going back to a situation of the kind that we had, it was in the late 90s, I suppose, when the chief patron of the PKK was in Damascus. You know, that may be the locus, the center of gravity for Turkish concerns in the future. And Turkey is going to need reassurance when it comes to those kinds of risks. And it's not going to be a short-term project.
Thank you very much, Ian. The next question is again to Barçın from Oktay Bingöl. The question, or more a statement to see if Barçın agrees, is I wonder if the feasibility to acquire S-400s was made in the relevant Turkish institutions. The decision to buy that system was taken after the 2016 coup attempt, when Turkish army had lost its influence in strategic political military decisions. My feeling is that the drawbacks of the decision have become apparent over time. I can therefore argue that this actually was not a tactical step. Let me actually add one more component to the question. The deliveries of the parts were actually, the deliveries of the S-400 components were made on the anniversary of the coup attempt. And that was probably a message as well. So what do you think, Barçın? What role did the military and other relevant institutions in Turkey play in this decision? Did they play any role?
I have tried to allude to this dimension in my previous answer, that's when I said that I had the feeling that this issue had taken a personal turn, because the usual conviction among those in Turkey who are following this issue is that there seems to be just one person who is fervently in favor of S-400, and that's the person who calls the shots. I haven't come across too many experts that would fervently defend or talk in favor of the S-400. So if I have well understood the question, I have the feeling that it was, I am not sure the army, the Turkish armed forces are so much supportive of this acquisition. At any rate, I would rather think that at this stage they wouldn't rather want it because of the consequences it will bring in terms of the F-35s, which would probably strike a serious blow to Turkish air forces. I am not really basing what I'm saying on too many conversations with military officials, though. So my answer has to be taken with a reserve. So in short, as I said, I think there's just one person who is really behind it, whereas you don't find too many that says, "Oh, this is a great idea." And as I said before in my answer, the coup attempt was certainly a turning point. But let's not forget that even after the coup attempt, Turkey sat on the table with the Americans again to buy the Patriots. But at that stage, the Gülenist issue, the coup attempt, remember the Barçın issue had taken hostage the relations. So the talks did not go any further. So even after the coup attempt, I recall the two sides speaking about if they can strike a deal on the Patriots.
Thank you, Barçın. And regarding the usefulness of the S-400s, some security analysts in Turkey argue that the Idlib battle was a litmus test for this. They argue that even if they were formally activated, the S-400s would not have been useful against Russian or Syrian planes over Idlib. And on the contrary, if Turkey had its F-35s, they could have been very useful in taking out Syrian air defense systems and therefore stripping Syria from their air dominance. So that's a litmus test on what could be useful for Turkey and what is not.
Well,
the next question.
Yeah, just to add to that, every time I speak to military experts, they kept saying that this would be as a standalone system, it's not going to be integrated in the NATO system. And as a standalone system, it wouldn't serve too much purpose. It would be too much of a very expensive purchase.
Yes. So there are two related questions, both addressed to Ian. The first one is from Dozakheim, which is, what is your sense of where the Kurdish matters now stand in Syria in relations with the United States? And the next one is a reaction to what Ian has said from Tahir Uysal. Isn't that, however, now that the United States seems to be acting as the patron of YPG, which Turkey considers to be the same as the PKK?
Well, thanks very much, Özgür, and thanks for the question, Dov. Thanks. Good to see you on the line. I think there, among the American strategic class, there has emerged a great deal of sympathy for the Kurds writ large. We know that's a complicated equation, and I don't think that's diminished. I think, along with many other things, it's gone out of the headlines just as the entire situation in Syria has gone out of the headlines. But on Capitol Hill, among Turkey watchers, among others, I think the sort of sympathy for the cause remains. And you know, to go back to the earlier point that was made, and also the follow-on question that you mentioned, yes, there is a certain ambiguity here. On the one hand, Turkey takes a very dim view of what of U.S. support for the YPG and what is seen as a kind of, in a sense, very fine distinction, if any, between that and support for the PKK. I do think there is a distinction there. It is hard to make. It's always been difficult to reconcile. You know, at a certain point, there were arguments in the US government about whether the United States should provide actionable intelligence for Turkey to strike against PKK bases, and the PKK, of course, is defined as a terrorist group by the United States. And in fact, we did provide that intelligence. So this is a fraught and very complicated set of distinctions, I think, for both countries. I think as much as Turkey is dissatisfied with the American posture around these issues, I think Turkey would also see risks in seeing the United States disengaged from the issue altogether, and therefore losing whatever influence it might have with the YPG. But the current circumstances, it seems to me, if they continue over the coming years, are going to drive the PKK in the hands of the Syrians and the Russians, and that's going to be an even more complicated issue for Turkey to manage. At the base of it all, of course, if Turkey could somehow get back to a political track in its relations with the Kurds inside Turkey, this would obviously be a game changer in a number of different ways. And I think there's tremendous disappointment. It's one of the long list of things that those who look at Turkey have been disappointed with in recent years in Washington, the failure to consolidate, the loss of that political opening. I know it was not an easy thing to manage. And there was enormous sensitivity to the terrorism side of this and other things, which you can't dismiss. But somehow, it seems to me, it's never going to be possible to take this issue off the table if Turkey doesn't come back to that kind of political engagement.
Özgür, may I add something? Now, on the one hand, the perception in Turkey is that United States is helping the PKK in Syria because YPG is seen as PKK, and on the other hand, I have heard as well that United States had been providing intelligence to Turkey so it can strike targets in Iraq. But now the interesting thing is that this part of this information is not known to Turkish public, and obviously, most probably, the United States doesn't want to come out and say, haha, I helped Turks in eliminating PKK targets, not to become itself a target, probably. But what I want to underline is that, that part of the story is not known to Turkish public, and what remains is that, U.S. is helping the PKK in Syria, and that goes as far as medium, small size businessmen, saying, okay, I'm not going to buy stuff from United States, and not, this is not just the iPhones, I'm not talking about that, but I'm not going to buy, if I have an alternative, I can go buy it from somewhere else. So I just wanted to put this as a footnote in terms of public opinion.
Ian, would you like to respond to Barçın's comment, or?
No, I think she's describing, yes, in a sense. I mean, I think she's characterized the sort of Turkish view of this very, 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 very accurately. I mean, it's a hugely neuralgic issue. And it does, in a way, illustrate something that I was trying to say earlier, that there are aspects of the US and Turkish strategic culture that are very, very similar when it comes to things like this. I mean, there are hot button issues for real understandable reasons. I don't know what the equivalent would be in the American context, but something to do with Al-Qaeda certainly would be close. We have this experience of an attack on our soil. It's closely felt by the population. It's very, very difficult to compromise on issues that relate to that, and it does excite public opinion in a way. I mean, that's a key point here. I mean, the relationship with the United States is embedded in the minds of the Turkish public and is part of the Turkish public debate in a way that there is no equivalent in the United States. The debate about Turkey in the United States is a specialist debate. even among foreign policy experts, it's in a sense a specialist debate. And it very rarely breaks into even the larger foreign policy discussion, but it does occasionally. And it did in the case of the S-400s. It has in the case of Syria and a few other things, but not often.
Again, I'm just going to add one thing, but if there are too many questions, it's okay.
No, please go ahead, Barçın.
Okay, look, you know, for years there was this, I would say, quote unquote, urban legend that, you know, United States helicopters would dropped military equipment to PKK in northern Iraq. And I would try to pursue this story, and usually the Turkish diplomats would have never confirmed me this quote unquote, maybe it's reality or urban legend. Now, the fact that for the first time officially, United States has said, first of all, there was a denial, complete denial. Oh, PKK is not the same thing with the YPG. And later on, I think they stopped saying it. So the fact that officially there was this recognition that there was this relationship, although underlined by saying, okay, this is not strategic, this is tactical, this has sort of vindicated some in the Turkish public opinion that, oh, you see, US is supporting the Kurdish cause in order to weaken Turkey. So, however, having said that, I think the recent developments, the fact that Turkey has sort of pushed Washington to make a choice between itself and the YPG has changed the air a little bit, but that probably came as a result of Trump's decision, you know, and the problem is, and probably this decision wasn't supported by the establishment, whether the army or the foreign ministry, I'm not sure. So the problem is, you know, what's going to happen if in the elections, you know, Trump were to lose?
Well, there is actually such a question coming up. But the next question is again to Ian on his favorite topic, Mediterranean. It comes from Steve Flanagan. The question is, the divergence in US and Turkish policies toward the Israel and on Palestinian issues have been a major factor in the deterioration of US-Turkey relations. In addition, the Trump administration has supported the Greek, Cypriot, Israeli, Egyptian claims in the maritime demarcation and development of gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean against Turkey's claims. Can you see any way to bridge these differences, whether Biden or Trump are president next year?
Well, thanks again. And you know, it's so nice to see so many friends on this call and also asking questions. Stephen, thank you very much for this. These are very tough issues. And I think the differences here are certainly on the question of Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, as long as President Erdogan is in power, as long as AK is in power, it seems to me this is going to be unbridgeable. I mean, there's just a deep ideological division on this point that is quite profound. And I don't think it would matter much the nature of the administration in Washington for that. There's no going back to the kind of closer relationship I think that Turkey and Israel once had, which the United States supported very strongly. That was in a different world. And I just don't think we're going back to that. With regard to the wider situation in the Eastern Mediterranean, I do think this is very fraught. It's gotten much more serious. It's gotten much more attention, not just in Europe, but also in Washington. And I think it risks polarizing views about Turkey even further, or I should say, deepening the dissatisfaction with Turkey in Washington. Because if you were to play this out as has happened, in fact, in relation to arms sales to Cyprus and other issues on Capitol Hill, there is a deep reservoir of support for Greece and Turkey on Capitol Hill. This used to be one of the key kind of cleavages politically in US foreign policy, and it went off the table because of the core détente between Greece and Turkey in recent decades. It would be terrible to lose that. I think the US has a very strong stake in stabilizing that relationship, because the consequences for the US, for NATO, for regional security would be very serious if there were to be a continued deterioration, with all the risks of brinkmanship that that would bring. Now, whether anyone's going to be quite as interested in the development of Eastern Mediterranean offshore energy under the current energy economy outlook, I'm not so sure, but that's a slightly different question. It is a dangerous situation. It's getting a lot of attention. If Biden were president, I don't think it would make any difference. I think in this case, the mood would be more or less the same. In fact, if anything, it would probably be more critical of Turkish behavior in the region.
Barçın, may I ask you a follow-up on this issue? What does Eastern Mediterranean mean for Turkey? Is it just the gas, or is there more?
No, I think it means much more. But I think again this motto that, you know, Cyprus is an aircraft, an island of aircraft is always valid. So I don't think the issue is limited to gas issues. The problem over there, I think, now as a journalist, I really do not harbor any sympathy for the Egyptian government due to its you know, human rights violations, and I can understand the Turkish government's irritation with the Israeli government policies. Having said that, the problem there, I think Turkey should have had somehow found a way to keep the communication channels open. Somehow it just had set and watch this sort of front of, you know, Greek Cyprus, Egypt, Israel building up, and with the last minute effort, it came to you know, involve an agreement with Libya. Having said that, and despite the fact that although I see military arm being flexed on the Eastern Mediterranean, I have read from between the lines that there is an effort on the part of Ankara to bring all the relevant side together and to talk about it, rather than, you know, solving it via a military crisis. But, you know, compared to all the rest of the involved parties like Italy or France, you know, obviously Turkey has much more at stake in East Mediterranean, and I think this is, you know, maybe unlike Idlib, for instance, I think it can find more public support in its policies in Eastern Mediterranean. Not that does the public support count so much on foreign policy, you know, some might question that, but still my hunch would be that there will be more understanding in terms of Eastern Mediterranean than compared to, you know, Idlib, for instance.
Thank you, Barçın. We have 3 more questions. The first one actually requires maybe a Trumpologist, which, you know, Ian is not one, but Ian, I will still direct it towards you. The question is from Mehmet Yeğin. There seems to be a chemistry between Erdogan and Trump. Erdogan's motivation in seeking close relations with Trump is apparent. What is the motive of Trump in maintaining close relations with Erdogan despite the opposition in Washington? How can we materialize Trump's motivation beyond admiration?
Wow, it's a question. You know, look, I mean, you can answer this at a number of different levels. I mean, you know, the first is that, you know, President Trump, and it's quite obvious, doesn't share some of the concerns that prevail in the foreign policy establishment when it comes to Turkey. Questions about media freedom and rule of law and the future of democracy don't figure largely in his foreign policy outlook. And so, you know, so it's not surprising that if you're looking for an opening, you know, Trump is where the place to look, and he reflects that in some of his discourse. I mean, the sort of most common way to explain this is that that the President Trump is inclined to see the world through, he personalizes these things. The good, the bad, those he has a rapport with, those he doesn't. By the way, there's nothing entirely novel about this. I mean, many American presidents have had strong views about foreign leaders. They just don't normally drive the policy in quite as distinctive a way as we're seeing in the recent years. And so I think it's the personalization. Obviously, at some point, they did develop some rapport, which both sides have found useful. It is consequential because a lot of the very neuralgic issues we've been discussing, very difficult to manage in conventional terms, could perhaps be solved with a telephone call between the two of them. You know, so that's sort of the bright side of this. The problem, of course, is that it's disconnected from the rest of the American foreign policy apparatus on Capitol Hill, in the professional foreign policy cadres, military. You know, there are different views prevailing, and this encourages a certain kind of bipolarity in American policy, which is difficult for not just Turkey but others to read. Turkey, I could understand, would want to take advantage of that, but I just think it's part and parcel of how President Trump has looked at the world and sees some sort of a kindred spirit. I'm entirely speculating.
There is actually a follow-up question from Andre de Munter, which is, President Trump and President Erdogan have quite a lot in common in terms of unpredictability and preparedness to go for quick fixes. In case of a democratic victory in the presidential elections, which would most probably bring more predictability on the US side, where and in which area would you see most potential for progress in the short term?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question. I think in terms of predictability in US foreign policy, there's no question that the Biden administration would represent a return to a more traditional approach across the board. Now, the world has changed in all kinds of ways, and you'd have to see how a new administration would respond. But in terms of kind of returning to some of the basic lines in American foreign policy in terms of alliance relationships and other things where Turkey also has a stake, I think, you know, it would be a much more traditional approach. Not necessarily one that Turkey would find congenial in all respects, let me say that. I mean, if you look historically, probably Turkey does best with moderate Republican administrations. There's no prospect of such a thing for the near future. So, you know, yes, more predictability from a Biden administration, but probably, ironically, more trouble for Turkish-US relations.
And of course, it would also be a rocky start because since President Trump was elected, Erdogan and his administration have been scapegoating the Obama administration for all of the problems between Turkey and the United States. And probably, I mean, Biden was the vice president of that administration, and the people he would bring on board, most of them would also be part of the Obama administration.
Yeah,
so
I mean, these
would be
people who would naturally, yes, exactly. I mean, the people who would naturally step into these roles, and that is really meaningful in the American system. You know, who the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs is and who's managing NATO affairs in the NSC and so on. These are people who are likely to know Turkey and Turkish policy very, very well, actually. That's a good thing. And if we can return to a bit more of the professional management of the relationship, that might not be such a bad thing. But in terms of the politics of the relationship, it could be a very, very rough ride.
Barçın, would you like to weigh in on the Erdogan-Trump relationship and the prospects of no? Okay.
Well, no, I totally and fully agree with you. From the Turkish side, what I can add is that I think the Turkish side sees in Trump someone who, it's going to be shrewd, but worships economy, money, you know. So that's why I think they had tried to induce economic relations into the equation. And that's why they put this $100 billion trade. And I think most probably the Turkish side wanted to lure a little bit Trump by the possible prospect of buying, making large purchases from Airbus, etc. But obviously, with the pandemic, this is going to look difficult. And in terms of the possibility of of a change in the administration, I can imagine that some in Ankara, especially the ones very close to the president, might be having some nightmare scenarios, because somehow my observation has been like Özgür's, there is this tremendous let's say negative outlook towards those who worked during Obama administration, and some of them would probably come along with Biden. And one of the aspects I see is that is somehow the personalization of issues. When you look at sometimes Israel and sometimes Egypt, again, as I said, while I can understand some of the reactions, still states always find ways of maintaining communication channels, but that hasn't been the case with this Turkish administration. So a change of administration in Washington, we should brace for a lot of trouble, I would imagine.
Özgür, if I may, just to add to that, I mean, one of the ironies here is that when the Obama administration came in, one of the very first trips that President Obama made was actually to Turkey, precisely because the administration saw it as one of these relationships that had been, the mismanagement of which had been emblematic of their own predecessor, the Bush administration. And so, it goes back to the point we made at the very, very beginning, it's always tough.
Yeah, and ironically, I mean, Trump has been the U.S. president with the most negative comments about Muslims. And in Turkey, we have a government who acts as the spokesperson of the Islamic world, whereas the statements made by Trump and the very first decision it took, etc., actually are contradictory. But that also shows. See the weighting. I mean, somehow there was such a crunch against the Obama administration. As I said, some are convinced that the decision to work with YPG, the fact that some are convinced that there is linkages with the Gülenists, they have left such a mark that they prefer to work with a leader that is very anti-Muslim, let's say, in his rhetoric.
And as a matter of fact, when President Obama was elected, anti-Americanism in Turkey, at least briefly, had actually weakened. I remember a Turkish citizen sacrificing a camel, or not one camel, I mean several camels, to celebrate the election of President Obama, and the Turkish public at large was actually very enthusiastic. But anyway, it didn't end very well. So the last two questions, one is from Lincoln McCurdy from the Turkish Coalition of America, and the question is, if Turkey activates the S-400s, would Republican senators press President Trump and Majority Leader McConnell to impose sanctions? Ian, I will direct this question to you, but also let me add one more dimension to this. Now there is, at least theoretically, the possibility that Trump could lose the election. His popularity is being eroded. Would that lead to some Republican senators trying to distance themselves from President Trump by taking a different position at selected issues? And of course, the Turkish portfolio would be very easy to differ from Trump. Or in case, let's say, Turkey activates the S-400s after the election in the United States, even if Trump is re-elected, then he will be a lame duck. Would that give the Republican senators, again, to distance themselves from Trump on this issue?
Well, I think my answer in all of those scenarios is roughly the same. If Turkey activates the system, the sanctions are coming. I could be wrong, but I wouldn't bet on it. And I think that's true whatever the political outcome in November. And already there has been a dissent by the Republican Party leadership with the Trump administration on this issue. I think when you get past the election, there would be very little incentive for them to even hold back on that.
Yes. Thank you, Ian. So the last question is actually a very, very good question. I'm not sure we have an answer for this. It's from Robert Bell again. In the strained relationship between the United States and Turkey of recent months, Ankara has threatened to evict the radar component of NATO's missile defense system from its Kürecik base in eastern Turkey if new sanctions are imposed. Since the NATO missile defense system, which is aimed at Iran and Syria and not Russia, would be blind without the radar component, has Iran's recent launch of a military satellites, which equates to a preliminary ICBM capability, prompted any statements from Turkey as to where it stands with regard to the threat to close the radar site? Barçın, have you heard anything about this?
No, actually, but I have to, I'm not sure Kürecik was ever mentioned. It was usually Incirlik who is usually mentioned, because I think the Turkish side, the Turkish officials are making a point of not, involving Kürecik because of its importance.
This time Kürecik was also mentioned.
Was it? Okay.
It was.
All right.
Was once or twice. It was.
Okay, then my mistake.
But let me turn to Ian. Robert, we are sorry, but during these days, these issues are not discussed publicly in Turkey. Even if a statement was ever made, it would have been made by President Erdogan and no one else. And I guess it wasn't, such a statement was not made, but it is a very good question indeed. But Ian, what does Iran's recent satellite mean for Turkey's own security? How should Turkey assess this?
Well, there have been differences, obviously, between the U.S. and Turkish approach to Iran. But, at base, many of the American concerns about Iran, and I'd say they're NATO concerns for the most part, are shared. Turkey has no interest in seeing a nuclear or even a nuclearizing Iran. What interest would Turkey have in seeing an Iran developing, longer range, more accurate ballistic missile systems and the means to target those? None of those things are in Turkish interest. Yes, Turkey may find it convenient to work with Iran from time to time. It doesn't have the same political hang-ups about dealing with the leadership, perhaps. But when it comes to these basic sort of issues of geopolitical competition, it seems to me Turkey has no stake in seeing, no interest in seeing Iran develop greater capabilities. That said, they also don't have an interest in seeing the United States and Iran coming to blows over these things either. And here's one area where, Robert, I'm aware it's a little off of your question, but perhaps it goes in a direction you'd be interested in. It seems to me that if there's a possibility, and there could be one in a Biden administration, of the United States to come back into the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran, which, by the way, the Trump administration has very recently been making some clever legal arguments that suggest that we're not out of this agreement either. We want to make a fuss about Iranian noncompliance now. It's quite interesting. But anyway, if there were conditions under which the United States could come back in, this would be very much in Turkish interest. It would put off the day of a nuclear Iran, perhaps forever. We can argue about that one, but at least for the moment. And it would take a lot of the pressure off of the U.S.-Iranian relationship, because at the end of the day, the worst case for Turkey is to see another regional conflict between these two parties, where Turkey would have to make some very, very difficult choices involving Incirlik and other things. Just to go back to that earlier part of the question, I think Turkey has every interest, if we're not on the same page bilaterally, at least let's keep the NATO side of this on a decent track. There's always been that distinction between, for example, NATO uses of Incirlik and bilateral uses of Incirlik. Turkey has every interest in maintaining a kind of viable seat at the table at NATO. There are already concerns in the alliance that Turkey maybe is eroding that relationship. It still functions rather well in many respects. I think it would be disastrous for Turkey to put more distance between Ankara and Brussels that way. You need NATO now more than ever.
Özgür, Özgür, thank you for coming in for me, and thank you for saying that indeed, unfortunately, one of the problems we have in Turkey is that some of the very important foreign policy issues are not seeing dynamic, pluralist debates in Turkey.
Yes. One more angle to this. Galip Dalay, who was supposed to be part of this conversation as a participant, could not log in due to technical reasons, but at one recent GMF event, he had made the following remark, that Turkey sees Iran as a regional competitor, but not as a rival. Although Turkey is pleased with Iran's competitiveness being crippled, Turkey, under no circumstances, wants to see a war against Iran. On the other hand, of course, Iran going nuclear would drastically increase Iran's competitiveness, a development that Turkey would definitely not like to see.
Actually, if I may add to that, for instance, I'm not sure, not that I'm sure, I'm sure Turkey is not happy to see Iranian presence in Syria. You know, it's one of the reasons why Bashar Assad regime is making so much progress is thanks to the Iranian support. And right now, currently, Syria is sucking all of Turkey's resources and energy. So I'm sure they're not absolutely happy. They're not happy to see Iranians there. Where there is a divergence with United States, I think, all over the years, is that Turkey did not believe that containment or confrontation will bring the desired result. You know, Turkey kept saying we have to engage Iran. The more we engage, the more we can get a result of it. Whereas usually the US administration position was engagement wouldn't bring a result. We have to confront them, and that's where they diverge. Otherwise, Turkey absolutely wouldn't want to see a strong nuclear Iran, yet it wouldn't want to see an Iran which is crippling under sanctions, because it's an important trade partner to Turkey, because Turkey needs trade. And when you look at its neighbors, all of them are under sanctions. You know, I mean, Russia under sanction, Iran under sanction, Iraq situation is there. So that's why I think obviously Turkey would be against nuclear Iran, but it wouldn't wish to see a crippled Iran as well.
And by the way, that position you've just laid out, Barçın, is rather close to the mainstream European position as well.
Precisely.
Where there is a lot of discomfort with Iranian proliferation efforts, its support for terrorism, proxies of all kinds, all of this sort of thing, their regional policy. On the other hand, the sanctions instrument is deeply unpopular, and the inclination for engagement is absolutely there. So, you know, it's an interesting example of where Turkey, you know, for all the differences, is actually rather in the European mainstream.
Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our conversation, so I will turn back to Ceylan. Thank you, Yinanç, Barçın.
Özgür, thank you very much for your help with the Q&A session, and Ian, Barçın, thanks a lot for your responses. And my main takeaway from today would be just to keep the dialogue open and find a remedy to fix the collapsed trust, as you mentioned, Ian. And with that note, I'm concluding today's discussion. It has been an honor to be on the same panel with you, Barçın, Ian. Thanks so much for your invaluable comments. And I would like to also thank to my colleagues, Özgür and John Alexander, for their support. And also, of course, to you all, to our audience, for joining us today. Next one, we will be continuing with our series. There will be another session on Friday. Please stay tuned. And for those who are on this side of the Atlantic, have a nice weekend, if you still can observe weekends during the pandemic. And for those who are on the other side of the Atlantic, happy, lovely Friday. And with that note, please stay healthy. Goodbye. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, Ceylan, Barçın, Özgür, everyone.
Yeah, it was nice seeing you.
Nice seeing so many friends. Bye.